32. Rodin walked fast, ridding his body of the pent-up energy, feeling the burn as his muscles rode out the adrenaline. How could he call himself a professional after that? So much had gone wrong in such a short space of time. He'd been alone with the target, and he hadn't even tried to remove the man. He'd been drawn into the counselor's ideas, tricked into ignoring the reason he was there. And then there was that bloody woman. Whatever she suspected, his stupid posturing had now confirmed it. Maybe she would tell Leopold all she knew, poison him against Rodin. Not disastrous, but it would make getting close to the target so much harder. And she was Paskia's guardian and in contact with Sergio. What other damage could she do? The whole thing was a mess, and as Rodin stomped along quiet backstreets he listed all the other mistakes he'd made since he set foot behind the glass. He should never have accepted this contract. Damn cat. He might have been wrong about Paskia, but Shay and her colleagues could still have hired mercenaries from the districts. And if those assassins didn't finish him, there was the threat from authority, both the official side and those Cat worked for. One side would incarcerate him in correction, the other side would end his life if he didn't complete this contract. Rodin's only way to escape the dome was to remove Leopold. Quiet as these streets were, they were not empty. Rodin forced Terrell to the surface, trusting his training to provide smiles and appropriate greetings. It was a sham, true, but wasn't that the same for everyone? Every person he'd met under the glass kept their real selves locked away, showing only a bland, acceptable facade. Shay was an obvious example, as was Perrin, but there were many others. Sergio wore the exuberant body of both a tortured artist and a fun-loving socialite, but his excitement at seeing Rodin exercising naked hinted at a darker side hidden under those rolls of flesh. Daventry worked for Sergio, but was also clearly influenced by Cat too, and Rodin was unsure where his loyalties really lay. And Paskia, with her memories eroded by authority, still harbored bitterness toward those in charge. Then there was Leopold. Maybe he spoke more freely than most, but his language was guarded and masterful. He hinted at possible thoughts but never fully committed, and his true feelings were obscured. Was he striving for freedom of movement between domes, or did he seriously hanker after a future where the glass was no barrier? Rodin's feet had led him into an area he didn't recognize, and Rodin took a moment to scan his surroundings. The 5-story buildings to either side were set back from the street by small paved areas behind ornate metal fences. Simple latch gates gave access, but each door was topped with an eye. The sign ahead read, Forest Avenue, and Rodin's first thought was to wonder where the trees were. But the name was familiar, and after a few paces he recalled where he'd read it. Shay lived in one of these buildings. Dryad House, Apartment 5. Rodin snorted a laugh. Once again his body, or his subconscious or something, had been working while he'd been struggling with questions. Just like he had found himself at Leopold's building, he now found himself here. But why? What could he do about Shay? Maybe he should remove her. If Cat's bosses wanted Leopold gone because he was becoming the figurehead of a rebellion, surely they'd welcome the removal of a central figure in that same rebellion. Dryad House was on the left, a couple of minutes' walk along Forest Avenue. There was a tree outside, one of those with needles rather than leaves, and it sat in a small patch of soil bordered by red slabs. It reminded Rodin of the raised beds on the roof garden, and of Frederick's make-believe landscape. Nature transplanted, trapped and molded for pleasure. Nature neutered. There was a path running alongside the building, and Rodin investigated. As dusk approached, shadows engulfed the passageway and the air was cool and refreshing. It opened into a wide space, the path crossing a grassy mound. Surrounding this, edging the fences at the rear of the buildings, were trees and bushes. Again they had been planted, providing privacy to those in the buildings. Rodin strode to the top of the mound, and turned to look at Dryad House. Like all the surrounding buildings, each floor had a balcony, with sliding glass doors. That must surely lead to the main living area, but to be sure Rodin pulled out his screen and called up plans. They weren't hard to find, the original architect apparently trumpeting his work as stylized living for those who appreciate the finer things in life, which sounded like hot air to Rodin. But there were plans, and even a virtual walk-through of a standard apartment. He watched, occasionally glancing up at the building itself to orientate the image with reality. The living area ran the width of the building. There was a bedroom to the front, with a lavish bathroom and another couple of rooms to the rear. Those must be behind the windows to the left of the balcony. Rodin thought it likely that Shay used one of these as an office or workspace, and Paskia had the other as her bedroom. A visual scan of the rear of the building showed no eyes, and the only security once through the trees and bushes was an easily climbable fence. The first-floor balcony could be reached with a running jump, and the rest of the climb up to Shay's apartment would present no difficulties. Worth noting. But he needed to concentrate on Leopold. Next time he met the counselor, Rodin knew he must act before the man started talking. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? The man was a master with his words, and he drew Rodin in, hypnotizing the assassin with ideas that, if Rodin were honest, made a hell of a lot of sense. Both the dome and the districts had developed, and where once each person could make a choice, now it was down to fortune. You were either born within the glass or without. And Jenna had been right, those in the dome got everything, while daily life in the districts was a constant struggle. There was art and sport under the glass simply because residents had spare time and energy. Could Sergio create his sculptures if he constantly feared an attack? Could all those people enjoy the gardens around the council buildings, if heading into woods or round a corner might lead to an encounter with someone wielding a weapon? Could someone like Leopold enjoy his nocturnal activities on the lake, if others were intent on taking his boat or his belongings or his life? But things weren't that simple. Paskia was proof of that. There might be nothing to fear from other residents, but that was only because anyone daring to even question the status quo was taken away. And as Leopold has suggested, this led to stagnation. Rodin saw that now. The districts were in constant flux. People lost their homes or they had to move for their own safety or to find work. Lines between the districts themselves were never hard, with allegiances changing with the weather. But in the dome, everything was constant. So much Rodin had seen over the last few days was exactly the same as when he'd been under the glass before. Why? Because the people were content in their little bubble of security. There was no desire to change. But stasis was not natural. People grew and developed. The world moved on. Trying to stop the flow was pointless. Which made Leopold's words so important. When he spoke, he forced others to confront their beliefs, to question their assumptions. With his position in the council, he had a voice, and he used that to make people think. If Rodin stopped the counselor, he was as bad as those in authority who had taken so much from Paskia. Yet he'd accepted the contract and there was no way out. He must remove Leopold. And as he paced, the muscles in his body pumping blood to his brain, the rhythm of his steps spurring his mind on, the kindling of an idea formed. It was far from a plan, but it was something. Rodin tossed it around in his head, testing it for cracks, stretching it to breaking point. He had to assume that Shay had poisoned Leopold's mind to Rodin now, and so she was involved. He needed to use her to reach the counselor. But when he next met Leopold, he needed to work quickly. For that he needed his tools, but they were in the halfway house. And after he'd silenced the man, he needed help that could only be found outside the dome. There was only one way he'd gain access to the districts. Rodin pulled out his screen and woke it. He tapped in Kat's contact information and wrote a message. I apologize for interrupting you in such a blunt manner, but I'd greatly appreciate your assistance. A current project I'm involved in has hit complications that I feel only you can solve. It will be easier to discuss this in person, so could we meet? I suggest where we last saw one another, in an hour's time. I know this is very last minute, but I'm sure you understand how completing this project promptly is in everyone's interests. Rodin sent the message, and headed for the Georgian Gallery. Even though the gallery was open late, few people visited this time of the evening, and Rodin reached the Serova suite without bumping into anyone. He stood before one of the pieces at the back of the room, a painting depicting an arm that had been sliced open to reveal bloody muscles and tendons. At the end of the arm was a hand, the nails painted brightly, but the fingers were curled over in pain. It seemed appropriate, the external beauty torn to reveal the ugly machinations beneath the surface. When Kat arrived, he made no pretense of admiring the artwork. He stood next to Rodin and folded his arms.
You wanted something.
I have a plan, but I need to set up a few things first.
So you want my help?
Rodin nodded and waited. Kat sighed.
Maybe I didn't make it clear last time we spoke, but I expect those I hire to get the job done themselves.
Rodin wouldn't let himself be bullied. I will. But I need certain things in place. From the corner of his eye, Rodin saw Kat's chest rise and fall.
I'm not guaranteeing anything, but what do you need?
He eventually said. I need to go back.
Back?
There was nobody else around, but Rodin couldn't risk being too explicit. Back to where we first met. There are people I need to speak to, things I need to set up.
It's no concern of mine what happens after the job is completed.
This is part of that job. I won't explain more. You'll have to trust me. Kat snorted, and despite himself Rodin shuddered. If Kat had been a friend before, and Rodin had his doubts about that, the next few moments could turn him into an enemy.
I don't see why I should help you. If you can't do this job, I'll have to hire someone else. It's not any concern of mine if you fail.
Rodin faced the man, looked him in the eye. With a smile he said, "Oh, but it is. If I fail, you hired the wrong person. To those you work for, that means you failed too." In the stillness Rodin heard Kat's breath, deep and slow. The man clasped his hands behind his back. Then he started to laugh.
Let me tell you something. When I was instructed to hire a suitable operative, the phrase hired thug was bandied about. But I argued that the job required stealth and finesse, and a certain subtlety that would be hard to find, especially with the limitations they imposed. This task required far more than a blunt tool. And now, you show just how nuanced a weapon you are. You play a dangerous game, but you play it well. I'm impressed.
Rodin wasn't. Enough blustering. Will you help? Kat's arm shot out. Rodin saw it, but only just, and as he jerked back, fingertips brushed his chin.
That was a warning,
Kat said.
If I'd been wielding a blade, I'm sure you can visualize the consequences.
Rodin thought back to the attack in the alley, and the controlled violence of the man. Even with his blades and lance, Rodin would not want to fight Kat.
I'll help, maybe, but only because I want this job out of the way,
Kat said.
You're in no position to call the shots. Clear?
Rodin nodded.
Good. 2 hours, and you need to be at the station. I'll arrange onward transportation too.
He tilted his head.
When do you need to return?
That would be a complication. I'll make my own way back.
You think I can trust you? No, I want to know you're back.
Rodin shook his head. That won't work.
Why not?
I have my reasons. There was a moment of silence.
If you're discovered with items that you should not have, then I can only provide so much protection. I called in a favor with authority once. You need to assume I cannot do that again.
Fine. Another pause.
You intend to use a gate then?
Rodin nodded.
Which one?
Rodin answered that with a glare. Kat stared back but then nodded.
I can go this far,
he said.
The pilot will take you to wherever you need to go, and will then drop you at whichever gate you use. He will report to me the instant you step from his vehicle. If I don't hear from him, I'll assume you've reneged on the contract and will take action as appropriate.
Rodin knew he wasn't going to get a better offer. I can work with that.
Good. So how long do you need?
Rodin calculated journey time, things he'd need to do, conversations he'd need to have. 4 hours.
Make it 3.
Rodin shook his head. Cutting it too fine. 3.5. A pause, then Kat's hat tipped forward.
3.5. Make sure you're there in time. You don't want me coming after you.
I appreciate your help. Kat sneered.
Spoken like a true resident of the Dome.
Then he spun and strode toward the door, leaving Rodin with the tortured images on the wall and a smile on his lips. At the station, Rodin strode to the door without hesitation. Even though it was plain with no sign, he recognized it. He knocked, and a man in white overalls opened it.
"Ah, good,"
he said, stepping to one side with a flourish.
"Come in, almost time for your shift. Always appreciate punctuality."
He looked Rodin up and down, then his gaze darted to one side where a woman walked along, eyes on the screen in her hand.
"Don't worry about your clothing, sir. We have plenty of spare overalls."
The talking stopped the moment Rodin entered the room and the man closed the door. He beckoned Rodin on, through another door, onto the small platform, then into the waiting train. As the train sped through the darkness, Rodin watched his reflection in the window. He still wore Terrell's clothing, but already his face was changing, the smile disappearing, the eyes growing sharper. Terrell faded, and Rodin returned to the surface. He breathed in the warm, dry air of the carriage, held it in his lungs, then slowly exhaled. He let his eyes close. The train tilted round a corner, the wheels clattering on the track. He was going home. Not permanently, of course, at least not yet, but for the next few hours he'd be free. No more watching his language. No more pretending to be someone else. No more fighting with words. Well, maybe there would be some of that. But he'd be able to use violence to back up his arguments. In some cases, anyway. The train drew to a stop, and was met by another man, wearing a loose-fitting jacket that could have hidden any number of weapons, and quite probably did. The man led Rodin along more corridors, then into a small room. The man didn't utter a word, but simply pointed to the box that sat on the table in the center of the room. Then he turned and left, the sound of his boots echoing off the grey walls. The box contained Rodin's own clothes, and he stripped, then put them on. There was no reflective glass, but Rodin brushed the trousers down, tugged at the jacket, felt the way the material moved with his body, and he knew he was ready. The man in the loose-fitting jacket returned, and led Rodin upstairs and to a door. He still didn't utter a word, even when he turned the handle and stood to one side as the door swung open. The air that rushed in enveloped Rodin in a fog that he pulled deep into his lungs, savoring the stale warmth that contained so much more honesty than the fancy fragrances under the glass. This was the smell of home, spicy food, an acidic edge, coppery overtones, and musty life. Rodin stepped out and looked up. There were stars where the clouds parted, but there was no glass, no barrier to stop the light drizzle that fell, coating his face and hair, dampening down the style he'd been forced to wear the last few days. The car was waiting, just as Kat had promised. The pilot turned in his seat, and Rodin was unsurprised that it was the same one who had driven them from Jenner's tower to the halfway house. That made sense, keeping the number of people involved to a minimum. Rodin leaned forward, ready to greet the man, but stopped himself. Instead, he gave the slightest of nods, climbed into the back seat, and told the pilot his first destination. With the pilot's monologue nothing more than background noise, Rodin watched the view pass by, as if the window was a screen showing a feed or a recording. It felt almost like watching memories. He'd received the scar on the back of his right hand in the cellar of that building with the black door, and in the alley over there he'd once dispatched a pair of muggers. The bar down that lane was a regular haunt of Runner, an ugly, vulgar woman who could source just about any weapon he cared to think about. And in that house on the verge of collapse lived an old man who could easily be bribed for information. This was home. This was where he belonged. It wasn't perfect, of course, and even as they drove past, Rodin noticed the stains and the debris, saw the aftermath of beatings and worse. A leg protruded from a pile of plastic bags. A man slouched in a doorway, liquid pooling beneath him as he shouted incoherently. A woman ran across the street, causing the pilot to swerve as he yelled abuse. But the imperfections were a small price to pay for freedom. The pilot brought the car to the first address on Rodin's list. There was a light on, second story, far right, good. His contact was in. Wait, he told the pilot. Then he stepped from the car and approached the building. 3 stops later and the dome felt like a bad dream. Rodin had almost everything ready, equipment collected, services secured, promises received. He'd uttered hardly any words, sticking mainly to fragments of sentences and stern looks. He'd given a few threats, though vague, but his reputation would fill in any blanks. Everyone was wary of a mercenary who was still alive. But the final meeting wouldn't be so easy. He looked to the pilot, saw the mask of a smile as the man swiveled round in his chair. "Jenna's tower," Rodin said. The pilot nodded, turned to face the front, and the car pulled away. Rodin let his head fall back, running once more through various options, planning for every possible way things could play out. He had to convince Jenna that this was for her own good. He had to make her understand that the gift he offered was well worth the price of the help he needed. He couldn't threaten, though, or use physical violence. He had to use words. And that didn't bother him like he thought it might. He'd sparred with Shay and engaged in debate with Leopold. He'd used words as playthings and weapons. Maybe his time under the glass wasn't a total waste. But he didn't want to stay in the dome. After he'd convinced Jenna, he'd have the pilot take him to the final address, the one that led to the gate, the one that would take him back across the glass. He'd find Shay, get what he needed from her, then he'd meet Leopold. One last time.